Welcome. It's time to settle down. Dim the lights, relax, and just listen. Let the rain outside, or maybe the quiet inside, set the mood. We have an hour of unsettling tales ahead, stories gathered from the shadows. Make sure you're comfortable. Our first story starts now. The first time I saw the 13th floor was just a few days ago, and I hope I will never see it again. It was a normal Monday, and I was exhausted after a long day of work. I work as a nurse at Westview Hospital, and my shifts were always draining, especially that day since I had to work a double. Finally, my shift ended and I hurried out the door. I appreciated not having to worry about parking in a city that was normally so busy. Living so close to work had its advantages. Westview was often still bustling at that hour, but tonight it felt eerily abandoned, as though the world had retreated into the shadows. My apartment building loomed ahead and I quickened my pace, anxious to get inside. I stepped into the lobby of Central Heights, passing by Ray the doorman and offering a polite nod to his wave. Normally, I would have stopped to chat, but I was too tired and was just looking forward to a bath, a stiff drink, and maybe a TV show before I collapsed into sleep. As I made my way toward the elevator, I was already scrolling through my phone for something to watch while waiting for the long ride to the 16th floor. I pressed the button and suddenly felt a strange sensation. The hair on my arms stood on end and I felt like I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing. No one was in the lobby. Ray was still at his station, absorbed in a novel. It must have been nothing, I tried to reassure myself. Yet, the feeling persisted, like unseen fingers trailing along my spine. When the elevator finally arrived, I stepped in without hesitation. I quickly pressed 16 and waited. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something odd. A powdery white dust near the elevator console. I checked myself to make sure I hadn't gotten any on me, but there was no trace of it on my clothes or skin. Then I looked closer and saw a chalk-like smudge right on the console between the numbers 12 and 14. A disturbing chill ran through me as my hand hovered near the strange mark. I paused, processing the bizarre sight before the bell chimed and the doors opened to my floor. Shrugging off the unease, I stepped off. I walked down the hall to my apartment and sighed with relief that my day was over. As I approached my door, eager to collapse onto my couch, I rummaged through my bag. A knot formed in my stomach as I realized my keys were still at the hospital, left on the break room counter. I groaned and trudged back to the elevator, resigned to having to retrieve them. I pressed the down button, and after a brief wait, the door opened, not far from where I stood. To my surprise, I wasn't alone in the elevator. There, occupying the small space, was an impossibly large figure draped in a long white coat. Their face was hidden by a hood, and their tall, rail-thin form exuded an unsettling presence. I took an instinctive step back, disturbed by the sight, but I tried to steady myself and not stare. I considered waiting for the next elevator, yet the door wouldn't close. The figure remained motionless, its hood concealing any trace of expression as it stared impassively. Realizing I had no way to get back to my apartment without my keys, I reluctantly stepped into the elevator with the tall figure and pressed the button for the lobby. That's when something made me do a double take. Even with the giant hooded figure standing silently beside me, I noticed an extra button on the panel, a softly glowing 13. It wasn't there earlier when I'd gone up to my own floor. I noticed the 13 button bore a large imprint of white chalky powder, and I saw that the looming figure's feet were also surrounded by that same odd substance. The elevator lurched into motion as I felt a cold dread wash over me. The buttons on the panel flickered in a strange, otherworldly rhythm as the elevator began its descent. The hooded figure beside me remained completely still, filling the confined space with an oppressive silence. I felt its unseen gaze upon me, its face forever obscured by the hood. My breath caught when the elevator slowed and the digital display above the doors flickered from 14 to a distorted blur, then to a number that sent a chill coursing through my veins, 13. When the doors slid open with a hollow clang, a dimly lit hallway unfolded before me, a place that didn't belong in my building. Thick, damp air spilled out, carrying the scent of old dust mixed with a trace of something metallic. My heart pounded as the figure stepped forward with an unervingly fluid grace. Pausing in the doorway, it slowly turned its hooded head in my direction, as though silently inviting me to follow. I stood rooted to the spot, unable to move. My legs refused to budge as my mind screamed for me to run, to shout, to do anything other than step further into that dark, unnatural space. Suddenly, I felt lightheaded and tried to steady myself against the elevator wall. But before I knew it, I crumbled to the floor, unconscious. When I came to, I sat up abruptly and nearly screamed, only to realize that I was still in the elevator. It had descended back to the lobby, and the strange hooded figure was nowhere to be seen. I had no idea how I had passed out. Perhaps I was more exhausted than I'd thought, yet it had felt so real, too real. I'd never experienced such a vivid nightmare before. As I stepped out, I glanced back at the elevator panel one last time and noticed a faint smudge of white powder near it. Shaken, I left and headed back to work to retrieve my keys. When I got back to my building, Ray commented on how stressed I looked. I told him it was nothing more than bad nerves after a long day. He nodded and I pressed on. Yet when I arrived at the elevator again, that inexplicable, unsettling feeling returned. Despite how late it was and how tired I felt, I decided to take the stairs. I was sweating and utterly exhausted after the climb, but eventually I reached my apartment. I chose to forego the bath in favor of a quick shower and then went straight to bed. The next morning, on my way to work, I was disturbed to see paramedics gathered outside the building. Approaching Ray, I asked him what had happened. His face was drawn, his usual smile absent. Leaning in closer and lowering his voice, he said, "It's Mrs. Donovan from 1406. They found her this morning when she didn't answer her door. Her daughter called, worried when she couldn't reach her. A chill ran through me. What happened to her?" "Nobody knows for sure," Ray replied, glancing toward the paramedics. "The police say it looks strange. There are no obvious signs of what killed her." But he hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. "They mentioned she was covered in some kind of white powder, like chalk or something. I've never seen anything like it in my 30 years here. The world seemed to tilt beneath me. White powder, just like in the elevator, just like in my nightmare." "Did you know her?" Ray asked, noticing the pallor in my face. "Not really," I managed to say, my mouth suddenly dry. "I only passed her in the halls sometimes." I tried to recall her face, but all I could conjure was a vague image of an elderly woman with silver hair who always nodded politely when we crossed paths. "They're saying it might have been sudden cardiac arrest, but who knows?" Ray continued. "Poor woman, living alone all these years after her husband passed. At least it was quick, whatever it was." I nodded mechanically, my eyes fixed on the elevator doors. I thanked Ray for the information and mentioned that I had to get to work. Yet deep down, I felt disturbed. I had wanted to dismiss the unsettling news about the tenant found dead. But with that bizarre substance mentioned, it was eerily similar to what I'd seen with that tall, hooded figure. The thoughts clung to me, refusing to let me find any peace. The rest of my workday passed in a hazy blur, and I felt detached from everything as I struggled to process the bizarre events of the previous night. I hurried home with anxious dread gnawing at the back of my mind. Arriving back at my apartment building, I mustered the courage to approach the elevator again. The metallic doors slid open with a soft ding, and though I hesitated for just a moment, I stepped inside. My eyes darted around the small, dimly lit space, half expecting shadows to flicker in the corners. Taking a steadying breath, I pressed the button for my floor while carefully scanning the panel for anything unusual. This time, the area between the numbers 12 and 14 was clean and unmarked, devoid of any peculiar chalky residue. The elevator hummed quietly as it ascended, leaving only the sterile scent of metal and the gentle whir of machinery. I exhaled a sigh of relief at the return to normalcy and walked down the hall to my apartment. Just as I inserted my key into the lock, I heard footsteps approaching down the hall. "Oh, hey! I thought that was you." I turned to see Chelsea Matthews, my neighbor from 1604, walking toward me with a reusable grocery bag slung over one arm. Her dark curls were pulled back into a messy bun, and though her face attempted a smile, worry was etched in every line. "Hi, Chelsea." I greeted her with a forced smile. Chelsea glanced over her shoulder before stepping closer. "Did you hear about Mrs. Donovan?" she whispered, her voice tight. I nodded, still holding my key in the door. "Ray told me this morning. It's awful. I can't stop thinking about it," Chelsea admitted, clutching her grocery bag closer to her chest. "I saw her just 2 days ago in the laundry room. She seemed perfectly fine, even talking about her granddaughter's ballet recital. A chill crept up my spine. Did Ray mention the white powder they found?" Her eyes widened. "Yes, that's what's so strange. My sister works at the police station as a clerk, and she couldn't tell me much, but she said the investigators were baffled. It wasn't any kind of drug or poison they recognized, just this weird chalky substance all over her apartment." Her voice dropped even lower. "The medical examiner still hasn't determined a cause of death." My legs felt weak as I leaned against the door frame. "That's disturbing." "There's something else," Chelsea confided, stepping even closer. "Mrs. Donovan mentioned something weird the last time I saw her. She talked about having nightmares of a tall figure in white visiting her at night." She shook her head. "I assumed it was just an old woman's imagination, you know? But now..." The key slipped from my fingers, clattering against the hardwood floor, making Chelsea jump. "Sorry," I mumbled as I bent to retrieve it with trembling hands. "Did she say anything else about this figure?" Chelsea furrowed her brow. "Just that it was impossibly tall and wore some kind of hood. She mentioned it even left marks on her floor, like footprints or something." She shrugged helplessly. "I figured it was just her medication giving her vivid dreams." My mouth went dry. "And you said this was 2 days ago?" "Yeah," she nodded. "The day before she died." Studying my face, she asked, "Are you okay? You look a bit pale." "I'm fine," I lied, forcing myself to stand a little taller. "Just tired from work. These double shifts are killing me." I fumbled with my key once more. "I should get some rest." "All right then. Take care and stay safe. I'll see you around, and don't work yourself too hard." "Have a good rest of the night," Chelsea said, waving as she headed back to her own apartment. I stepped inside my apartment and released the breath I hadn't realized I was holding, my mind still echoing with all the disturbing things Chelsea had said about Mrs. Donovan and her untimely death. Pushing myself away from the door, I moved through my darkened apartment, flipping on lights as I went. The shadows seemed longer tonight, and the corners of my home appeared darker and more ominous. In the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of wine with shaking hands, spilling a few drops on the counter, though I didn't bother to wipe them up. The television droned on in the background as I curled up on my couch, wrapping myself in a throw blanket despite the warmth of the apartment. News footage of paramedics outside my building played silently, a reporter discussing the mysterious death of an elderly resident. I quickly changed the channel. Sleep proved impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, that hooded figure and the impossible 13th floor replayed in my mind. Chelsea's words about Mrs. Donovan's nightmares echoed incessantly. The same nightmares I'd had, the same figure I'd seen. Around midnight, I finally dragged myself to bed. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling and listening to the occasional creaks and groans of the building settling. My eyelids grew heavy despite my anxiety, and eventually I drifted into an uneasy sleep. I woke with a start, my alarm blaring beside me. For a moment, I felt disoriented. unable to tell if I had truly slept or merely closed my eyes for a few minutes. My body felt heavy and my mind foggy as I dragged myself out of bed and into the shower. The hot water did little to wash away my unease. As I dressed for work, I found myself continuously glancing toward my door, half expecting a knock or the turn of the handle. I chided myself for being irrational, but couldn't shake the dread that had firmly taken root in my mind. My morning routine took longer than usual. Every sound startled me. By the time I was ready to leave, I was already running late. I hesitated at my door, took a deep breath, and stepped into the hallway. The corridor was quiet, with morning light filtering through the windows at each end. I locked my door and headed toward the elevator, only to freeze mid-step. There, in the middle of the hallway, stood Chelsea. I recalled that she worked at a different hospital across town, yet she was in her hospital scrubs, though they looked rumpled as if she'd slept in them. Her hair hung loose and tangled around her shoulders. "Chelsea," I called out cautiously. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond at first, remaining perfectly still with her gaze fixed on the wall. Something about her unresponsive stillness sent a chill down my spine. "Chelsea," I tried again, gently reaching out to touch her shoulder. At my touch, her head snapped toward me, but her eyes remained unfocused, gazing through me rather than at me. Her pupils were dilated and her face looked unnaturally pale. "It comes at night," Chelsea whispered, her voice raspy and strange. "The shadow of death. It wears white, but leaves darkness. It marks them first. The 13th floor. It's waiting there." My blood ran cold. "Chelsea, what are you talking about? There is no 13th floor." "I saw it last night," she continued, her voice slurring slightly. "In the elevator." The button appeared. White dust. So cold. She shuddered violently. "It knows who's next." I gripped her shoulders, shaking her gently. "Chelsea, snap out of it." Blinking rapidly, Chelsea's eyes gradually focused. Color slowly returned to her face as confusion took over. She looked around, disoriented, before finally recognizing me. Why am I in the hallway?" she murmured, touching her forehead and wincing. "God, I have such a headache. Was I sleepwalking?" "I'm not sure," I said uncertainly, my eyes still fixed on her face. "You were just standing here talking about strange things." "What things?" she asked, frowning as she rubbed her temples. I hesitated before replying. "About a shadow of death and the 13th floor." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "I don't remember any of that." Glancing at her watch, she gasped, "Oh God, I'm late. I need to get to work." She hurried toward the elevator, then paused and looked back at me with an embarrassed smile. "Sorry about that. Must have been sleepwalking or something. Too many night shifts, you know?" Before I could utter a word, Chelsea disappeared around the corner toward the elevator, and I stood frozen in the hallway, my mind racing. The coincidence was too overwhelming, Mrs. Donovan's experience, my own, and now Chelsea mentioning the same horrors. Later, at work, I couldn't focus. Twice, I nearly administered the wrong medication to patients, catching myself just in time. Colleagues asked if I was feeling ill, noting my pallor and distracted state. I blamed it on lack of sleep, which wasn't entirely untrue. During my lunch break, I sat alone in the hospital cafeteria, picking at a salad that I had no appetite for. I pulled out my phone and searched for information about my building's history. Central Heights had been built in the 1970s and renovated in the early 2000s. Nothing unusual, a standard high-rise apartment building. I scrolled further until I stumbled across an old newspaper article about an architectural controversy during its construction. The original plans had included a 13th floor, but due to superstition, the developers had labeled it the 14th, skipping 13 altogether. What caught my attention was a small paragraph noting that the chief architect had either gone missing or died mysteriously before construction was completed. His body was never found either way. My hands trembled as I set down my phone. couldn't be a mere coincidence. The rest of my shift dragged on endlessly. By the time I clocked out, darkness had fallen, and a fine mist hung in the air, diffusing the streetlights into hazy orbs. I considered taking a different route home, maybe even staying at a hotel for the night, but the thought seemed ridiculous in the rational light of the hospital lobby. I pulled my coat tighter around me and stepped out into the night. The walk home felt longer than usual, each shadow making my heart skip a beat. When I finally reached my building, I noticed Ray was gone for the day, replaced by a night doorman whose name I couldn't recall and who barely looked up from his phone as I entered. I hesitated at the elevator and then decided to head for the stairs, unwilling to risk another encounter. However, when I reached the door to the stairwell, to my shock, it was locked. I turned around and tried to flag down the night doorman, but he had vanished. I looked around, unsure of what to do next, when suddenly the elevator doors opened. I stared at the vacant elevator, its fluorescent light flickering ever so slightly. The interior was pristine. No white powder, no mysterious buttons, no towering figure, just an ordinary elevator waiting patiently for a passenger. Rational thought urged me to step inside, especially since the stairwell was locked and I needed to get to my apartment. Yet my feet remained rooted to the lobby floor, my body refusing the simple command to move. A soft chime sounded as the doors began to close. Acting on instinct, I lunged forward, thrusting my arm between the closing doors. They retracted immediately, and I stepped inside, my heart hammering against my ribs. My finger hovered over the button panel. 16. I could just press 16 and go home. But then my eyes were drawn to the space between 12 and 14, the unmarked space where 13 should be. The doors closed behind me with a soft thud that, in my heightened state, sounded like the slam of a prison gate. I pressed 16 quickly, then backed into the corner, watching the numbers illuminate as the elevator began to ascend. Everything seemed normal at first, and as I ascended, I tried to ignore the lingering feeling of dread. I watched the display numbers slowly increase. Then, to my horror, the elevator stopped. It had halted at 12, but the door wouldn't open. Then the number distorted and went blank, and I felt the elevator creeping up several more feet before stopping on a floor higher than the 12th. The door slid open, and there it was. A hooded figure stood in the doorway, impossibly tall, its white coat hanging from skeletal shoulders. I pressed myself against the back wall of the elevator. My scream caught in my throat. White dust swirled around the figure's feet, drifting into the elevator like fog. "Please," I managed to whisper, though I wasn't sure what I was begging for. The hooded figure bent down and stepped into the elevator. With each step, a noxious cloud of chalky dust spread around it, and I covered my mouth in horror. It extended one impossibly long arm, the sleeve falling back to reveal a hand made entirely of bone, gleaming white in the dim light. It reached out with slow, deliberate motion. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "No," I said, my voice growing stronger. "I won't go with you." The figure tilted its hooded head, as if puzzled by my refusal, took a step forward. With every movement, white dust billowed, filling the cramped space with a fine mist that made me cough. A cold emanated from it, an otherworldly chill that penetrated my soul and froze my thoughts. Its hand moved toward the panel, paused, then withdrew as it stepped back into the opposite corner of the elevator, stood motionless, waiting for the doors to close. I couldn't fathom why it had ignored me, seeming content to ride the elevator up to the 16th floor rather than drag me down into the sepulchral darkness of the 13th. The elevator rose without further incident, the floors passing by in terrible silence as I remained breathless and terrified alongside my monstrous companion. When we arrived at the 16th floor, the entity extended an arm as if bidding me to disembark first. Oddly polite, though still utterly horrifying. I took a nervous step forward, scared of moving, yet even more terrified of staying a moment longer with that skeletal nightmare. I crept past the looming figure and eventually broke into a mad sprint down the hall toward my apartment. I stole one last glance behind me. The thing was gone. Whatever it had been doing on that floor, I couldn't say, but I felt an urgent need to get inside and hide as quickly as possible. I made it to my door, my heart racing as I fumbled with my keys before throwing myself inside, quickly closing and locking the door before bolting to my bedroom. The night stretched on interminably as I huddled beneath my blanket, feeling both foolish and fearful. Part of me knew that the skeletal figure I dreaded wouldn't materialize in my bedroom or elsewhere in my apartment. Yet another part couldn't shake the unsettling anticipation that it might. As the hours dragged by with no sign of the apparition, I hesitated, relieved yet still anxious, before finally succumbing to an uneasy sleep. That sleep, however, was short-lived. I awoke abruptly to a horrible scream that pierced the quiet night. Bolting upright, my heart pounding, I realized the scream wasn't part of a nightmare. It echoed through the hallway outside my apartment, followed by a heavy thud. I scrambled out of bed, fumbling for my phone as I debated whether to call 911 or hide in the bathroom. A strange compulsion drew me toward the door instead. I pressed my eye to the peephole, my breath fogging the small glass circle. At first I saw nothing, then movement caught my eye, a figure walking slowly toward the elevator. It was Chelsea. Her movements were unnervingly stiff, limbs jerking slightly with each step as if controlled by invisible strings. Her eyes were wide and vacant, staring straight ahead. Behind her loomed that same white-robed figure, impossibly tall, its skeletal frame nearly brushing the ceiling. One bone-white hand hovered inches from Chelsea's back, guiding her without actual contact. White dust billowed with each unearthly step, leaving a trail of chalky footprints on the carpet. "Chelsea?" I whispered, my hand clutching the doorknob. I knew I should open the door, or scream, or do something, but my body refused to move. Chelsea and the figure reached the elevator. The doors slid open without either of them pressing a button, revealing an inky darkness. As they stepped inside, Chelsea's head turned slowly, mechanically, toward my apartment. Even through the peephole, I could see that her eyes were completely white now, dusted with the same chalky substance trailing behind the hooded figure. Our gazes locked for one terrifying moment before her face went slack again, and she and the figure stepped into the elevator. The doors closed with a soft chime that seemed disturbingly ordinary amid the horror. I stumbled backward from the door, my legs giving out as I collapsed onto the floor, my breath coming in short, painful gasps. Chelsea, the figure, was taking her to the 13th floor, just as it had tried to take me. Images of Mrs. Donovan's death flashed through my mind. Found covered in white powder, dead without explanation. I knew I had to do something. I had to help Chelsea. With trembling hands, I dialed 911, but the call wouldn't connect. My phone showed full service, yet the call failed repeatedly. Frustrated, I tossed the useless device onto the couch and scrambled to my feet, pulling on a sweatshirt over my pajamas and shoving my feet into sneakers. The rational part of me screamed that I should stay inside, lock the door, and wait until morning. But Chelsea was my neighbor, and I had to try and do something. I grabbed a kitchen knife, fully aware that it would be useless against whatever that thing was, yet clinging to the faint feeling of security it provided. I flung open the door and stepped out into the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs. The corridor was empty now, but a ghostly trail of white powder led me to the elevator. Clutching the knife in my sweaty hand, I followed the shimmering, luminescent powder on the carpet. When I reached the elevator, I saw the doors still closed and the indicator light paused between floors. My finger hovered over the call button. Was I really doing this? Was I truly going to follow that thing to wherever it had taken Chelsea? Before I could decide, the indicator light began to move again. The elevator was coming back up. I ducked behind a decorative plant in the corner, crouching low as the elevator chimed its arrival. The doors slid open, revealing an empty car. No sign of Chelsea or the figure, just more of that white powder dusting the floor. I approached slowly, knife extended before me. The elevator's interior had a thicker layer of the powder, swirling gently as if disturbed by an unseen breeze. Something compelled me forward, not curiosity, but a desperate need to find Chelsea and rescue her from whatever fate had befallen Mrs. Donovan. I stepped inside, my shoes leaving prints in the dust. The doors closed behind me, and I realized I hadn't pressed a button. The panel remained dark. No, I whispered to myself. I was too late. The only trace left was the eerie powder shaped like a skeletal finger pressed on the section between the 12 and 14 buttons. I stepped off that horrific elevator and walked numbly back to my apartment, praying that all of this was just a terrible dream. The next day, my greatest fears were confirmed. I rushed downstairs as quickly as I could, and upon emerging in the lobby, I saw the police and paramedics gathered outside the building. My heart sank. Ray was back at his post and, noticing my horrified expression as I appeared in the lobby, he confirmed the truth I had been dreading. With an ashen face, he said in a low voice, "Found her in the hallway this morning, just like Mrs. Donovan. No signs of a struggle, no obvious cause." Leaning closer and glancing around the empty lobby, he added, "And that same white powder all over her. The police are saying it might be some kind of toxic substance in the building. They're bringing in specialists today." I gripped the edge of Ray's desk to steady myself. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern deepening the lines on his weathered face. "You look a bit shaken." "I'm fine," I lied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Just shocked. I talked to her yesterday. She seemed fine." Ray nodded solemnly. "They're saying it might be some kind of chemical hazard. Management's called an emergency meeting tonight. They are trying not to freak people out." He hesitated, then added quietly, "Between you and me, I've been working here for 16 years. I've never seen anything like this. 2 people in 1 week under the same mysterious circumstances. Has anyone else reported anything unusual?" I asked in a barely audible whisper. "Anything about the building? The elevator?" Ray's expression shifted subtly. "Funny you should ask. Mrs. Henderson from 1202 mentioned something about the elevator stopping on a floor that doesn't exist." He shook his head. "I told her she must have pressed the wrong button or imagined it. 13th floor superstition gets to people. This building is old enough to have its quirks." I nodded mechanically. Someone else had seen it. I wasn't losing my mind. "Ray," I said carefully, "have you ever noticed anything strange about the elevator? White powder, maybe, or unusual people using it late at night?" Ray's eyes sharpened as he studied me. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," I offered, my attempt at casual conversation failing miserably. Glancing around once more, Ray motioned for me to lean closer. "There have been stories about this building for years," he whispered. "Back in the 70s, during construction, workers refused to continue after dark. They said they saw things. Management called it superstition and fired anyone who complained." He paused before adding, "The architect went missing and the foreman died before it was finished. Found in the elevator shaft between what would have been the 13th floor. Covered in white powder," I murmured, finishing for him. His eyes widened, and he nodded slowly. For a long, heavy moment, Ray was silent. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I've worked here for 16 years. I've seen residents come and go. I've watched this building age. 3 years ago, the night janitor quit without notice, left his keys, his uniform, everything. He just disappeared. Before he left, he told me something I've never forgotten." He swallowed hard. He said he'd seen death itself in the service elevator, wearing a heavy white coat. A chill ran down my spine. "And did you believe him?" "I didn't," Ray admitted. "I thought he was hitting the bottle too hard. But then," he trailed off, glancing toward the bank of elevators, "I've seen things too. glimpses, shadows where there shouldn't be shadows. "Why haven't you left?" I asked quietly. Ray's expression hardened. "This is my home. It has been for a long time. Whatever's happening, I'm not letting it chase me away." He straightened, returning to his professional demeanor. "You should be careful. Maybe stay with family for a few days until they figure out what's going on." I nodded, though I knew no investigation would uncover the truth. What was happening defied all rational explanation. "Thank you, Ray," I said, turning toward the door. "I'll be careful." I briefly considered taking the day off from work, but I decided against it since I figured I could use the distraction to ignore the insanity swirling around me there. At the busy hospital, I almost forgot the horrors of the night before. But as my shift ended, the dread of returning home settled over me. I lingered for a while, making small talk with colleagues who were just starting their shifts, anything to delay the inevitable. Outside, twilight had fallen. The streets were quieter than usual, or perhaps it only seemed so to me as each echoing footstep counted down the moments until I got back to my home. Central Heights loomed ahead, its windows lit against the darkening sky. How many residents had no idea what lurked between the floors? How many came and went, oblivious to the horror stalking the hallways at night? As I approached the entrance, I noticed a small crowd gathered outside. Police tape cordoned off part of the sidewalk, and officers were speaking with some residents. An ambulance idled nearby, lights off but doors open. "What's happening?" I asked a pale-faced woman hovering at the edge of the crowd. The woman turned and said in a shaky tone, "Another one, Mrs. Henderson from 1214. Found her in the stairwell about an hour ago." My blood ran cold. Mrs. Henderson, the same woman Ray had mentioned, who'd seen the 13th floor. My legs nearly gave way. "White powder?" I asked, already dreading the answer. She nodded. "That's what they're saying. Just like the others. 3 deaths in 1 week. People are talking about moving out." I pushed through the crowd toward the entrance. Ray wasn't at his post, probably being questioned by the police, and the other night doorman looked visibly shaken. "Excuse me," he called as I passed. "They're advising residents to stay elsewhere tonight if possible. Building management is putting people up at the Coventry Hotel until they determine if there's an environmental hazard." "Thanks," I mumbled in a terrified daze. I wasn't in any mood to argue. I headed for the Coventry Hotel, hoping for a night's safety away from the building and its haunting specter of death. After checking into my room, my mind whirled with doubt and fear. The terrifying enigma of Central Heights dominated my thoughts, compelling me to consider leaving. Whatever was happening in that building, be it a deadly hallucinogenic powder or the grim specter of death itself, it did not matter anymore. I had to get out. The urge to flee was overwhelming, though a small, nagging part of me hesitated at the idea of abandoning the familiar for the unknown. I didn't have much money, and while I could potentially find a smaller place and hire movers to leave that cursed building behind, the decision felt more daunting than ever. I eventually resolved to leave and find someplace else to live. It was a hasty decision, but I grimly speculated that it might be a life or death situation, and I shuddered at the thought of the people I knew who had already been taken. With that resolution, I tried to settle down, and at last, I fell into a relatively comfortable sleep. Then, as if in the very next moment, my eyes snapped open in a flash. To my horror, I was alone in the elevator. White dust was everywhere, on the floor, swirling in the air, coating my skin. The numbers on the panel flickered, and a single glowing button remained, 13. I hadn't pressed it, but the elevator moved anyway, descending to a floor that shouldn't exist. When the doors opened, I didn't see a hallway but a vast, cavernous space. White dust drifted like snow in stagnant air. In the center stood that hooded figure, even taller than before, its skeletal hands extended toward me. At its feet lay 3 bodies, Mrs. Donovan, Chelsea, and Mrs. Henderson, their skin bleached white, eyes open yet unseeing. Behind the figure, More shapes emerged from the swirling dust. Dozens, hundreds of them, all victims of the thing that dwelled between floors. And it was waiting for me to join them. Despite my overwhelming horror, a strange compulsion tugged at me, defying all logic. Before I could resist, my feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the morbid sight. The doors closed behind me with a metallic groan, and in the distance, I heard the faint hum of the retreating elevator, leaving me alone with that enigmatic figure. It moved ahead, its long coat dragging along the floor and leaving a trail of white, chalky dust. In a daze, I followed, as the oppressive silence wrapped around me like a shroud. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly, its walls lined with doors that bore no resemblance to those in my own building. They were older, heavier, each adorned with strange symbols that pulsed faintly in the dim light. Abruptly, the figure halted, tilting its head slightly as if straining to listen to something. I strained my ears, desperate to catch any sound, but only near silence met me. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, I began to hear a faint whisper, soft and indistinct, steadily growing louder. The sound sent shivers down my spine, completely out of place in that world. The figure turned to face me, and for the first time, I noticed a subtle movement beneath its hood. Shadows twisted and writhed within. My breath caught as the figure raised a hand, its impossibly long, pale fingers pointing toward a door at the far end of the hall. As the whisper grew clearer, a jolt of terror struck me when I heard my name called repeatedly in a voice disturbingly familiar. The door at the end of the hall creaked open by itself, revealing a space bathed in eerie, flickering light. I took a hesitant step back, but it was too late. The figure seized my arm with a cold, unyielding grip and pulled me forward. I stumbled toward the open door as the whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar, and in that moment, I stepped through the threshold into a nightmare from which I might never awake. And yet, I did wake, gasping and tangled in sweat-soaked sheets. The hotel room was dark except for the red glow of the digital clock reading 3:13 a.m. My heart pounded painfully against my ribs as I fumbled for the bedside lamp. Light flooded the room, revealing ordinary hotel furnishings.
No dust.
No figures, just a bland room with standard artwork and heavy curtains drawn against the night. I collapsed back onto the pillows, trying to slow my breathing. It had just been a nightmare, but as I glanced toward the carpet near the door, I saw a fine white powder dusting the threshold, as if someone or something had tried to enter. Frozen, I stared at the white trace. It hadn't been there when I checked in. Then a sinking dread gripped me. My eyes darted down to my feet, now engulfed in a thick layer of the eerie, chalky substance. Panic surged as I bent to touch my foot, and there it was, a bruise vivid and sinister, marking the exact spot where an otherworldly hand had seized my arm with unyielding force. Desperation clawed at my mind as I scrambled for a shred of logic, but only chaos answered. The figure had found me. Even here, miles from Central Heights, it had tracked me down. Or perhaps I had even ventured into its lair in my sleep. Couldn't be real, but the powder by the door and on my feet was real. The deaths were real, and whatever was hunting me wouldn't stop until it had claimed me too. I hurriedly dressed, hands shaking as I stuffed my few belongings into a bag. I knew I had to leave, to put as much distance as possible between myself and everything here. I crossed several state lines and did not have a destination, besides as far away as I could get from that nightmare and the being that might even now still be searching for me. Yet, even abandoning my possessions and leaving, doubt still gnaws at my resolve. Perhaps leaving the city entirely and abandoning everything might be enough. But deep down, I wonder whether it could ever be enough. I don't know if I can ever outrun the shadow of death itself that haunts the 13th floor. I never saw their face, not in all that time. That absence is a void that gnaws at me more than the memories themselves. The voice, when it came, was synthesized, perfectly neutral, devoid of inflection or gender, calmly delivering instructions via the screen, laced with the faint scent of ozone from the vents. It never conveyed anger, only procedure, which made the entire ordeal feel clinical, detached, and infinitely more terrifying. The moment of capture is seared into my memory with a clarity that feels like a brand. A sudden downpour after leaving the library late one evening, fumbling with my phone under the inadequate shelter of a bus stop awning, trying to hail a ride. A cloth pressed over my face, smelling sharply of chemicals. A brief, muffled struggle, then blackness. I awoke on a firm, narrow cot in a room devoid of feature, save for its oppressive whiteness. White walls, white floor, white ceiling, white thin blanket.
No windows.
A single, flush light panel overhead glowed with a soft, constant white light that never varied. The air hummed faintly and smelled sterile, like a hospital mixed with the charged scent before a thunderstorm. My street clothes were gone, replaced by simple gray cotton scrubs. My shoes were missing. One wall held a solid white door, seamlessly integrated, with no visible handle or hinges on my side. High in one corner, a small, dark lens, a camera, observed me silently. I knew instinctively I was under constant surveillance. I spent the first cycle, I couldn't call it a day, staring at that unblinking eye, trying to project defiance I didn't feel. When I tried yelling, asking questions, the sound seemed deadened by the room's featureless surfaces, absorbed without echo. The first message appeared abruptly on a small, smooth screen set flush into the wall opposite the cot. Simple black text on a white background. Harm is not intended contingent upon protocol adherence. The synthesized voice read the words aloud simultaneously, calm and neutral. I demanded answers. Who are you? Why am I here? What do you want? Silence. Then, new text appeared, read aloud by the same dispassionate voice. Protocol Alpha. Remain within designated floor perimeter. A faint line, barely visible, marked a rectangle a foot from the walls. Protocol Beta. Consume nutrient paste when screen displays consume. Protocol Gamma. Initiate rest cycle when screen displays rest cycle. The overhead light panel never truly turned off, only shifted intensity slightly for the rest cycle. When consume appeared, a small slot near the floor hissed open, revealing a tray with a small bowl of odorless, gray nutrient paste and a plastic spork. Tasted like nothing, but it kept me alive. I followed the protocols. What choice did I have? Time dissolved. Without windows, without clocks, without any variation in light or sound beyond the screen commands. The cycles blurred into an endless white monotony. I tried scratching marks on the floor to count, but the surface was unnaturally smooth, resistant. I recited poetry, sang songs softly, anything to hear a human voice, even my own. Always I watched the camera lens. Always I felt its cold observation. Desperation breeds recklessness. Weeks, maybe months into the white void, I decided to deviate. During a rest cycle, pretending to sleep, I took the plastic spork, surprisingly sturdy, and pried at the edges of the nutrient paste dispenser slot. It was recessed, tightly sealed. I managed to chip off a thin, sharp shard of the plastic housing before the effort became too risky. I hid the shard under my thin mattress. Later, during a consume cycle while the slot was open, I tried to use the shard to probe the mechanism inside, hoping to jam it, disrupt the routine, anything. I don't know how they knew. Perhaps pressure sensors. Perhaps the camera's unblinking, I saw the subtle movement. The screen instantly flashed bright red. Protocol violation detected. Before I could react, an intense, low-frequency sound filled the room. It wasn't just loud. It was a physical pressure, vibrating through my bones, making my teeth ache and my vision swim. Nausea overwhelmed me. I collapsed, curling into a fetal position, hands clamped over my ears, but the sonic pressure bypassed them, drilling directly into my skull. felt like my brain was being vibrated loose. Just as I felt consciousness slipping, it stopped. The screen returned to white. New text appeared. Deviation is inefficient. Adhere to protocol. Warning logged. The neutral voice read it aloud. I lay trembling on the floor, the phantom vibration echoing in my bones. I never touched the slot again, but the violation revealed something. They reacted. They had limits, and they had technology susceptible to disruption. My mind clung to that. I became the perfect subject, followed every command instantly, showed no resistance. I ate the paste. I rested on cue. I stayed within the lines. I gave them the compliance they seemed to value, until I heard the tapping. It was incredibly faint, almost subliminal, coming from within the wall shared by the adjacent space, wherever that was.
Top, top, pince, top, top, top.
It wasn't random. It sounded like a code. Hesitantly, during a rest cycle, I tapped back on the wall with my knuckle.
Top, top.
Pause. Then, from the other side, tap, tap. Contact. Someone else was here. Over cycles that felt like weeks, using a simple number-to-letter code based on tap counts, we communicated. Her name was Maria. She'd been moved between different environment rooms, yellow, gray. Now one she described as too dark. She confirmed the captors played psychological games, rewarded compliance, punished deviation harshly. She warned me they monitored everything. She didn't know how many captives there were or the purpose. The night the screen displayed system maintenance instead of rest cycle, the humming of the vents changed pitch slightly. An opportunity? Maria had previously tapped out a number sequence 7-3-9-1. Related to the brief flicker pattern the main light panel sometimes made just before a command changed. She thought it might be significant, maybe an override or exit code. It was a long shot. I waited, hidden shard of plastic clutched in my hand, heart pounding against the silence. Then I heard it, not on the screen, but a real sound. The faint hiss of the sealed door sliding open. They were coming in. I feigned deep sleep on the cot, every muscle tensed. Slow, quiet footsteps entered the room. I could smell that faint ozone scent again, stronger now. A shadow fell over me. They were leaning over the cot. Doing what? Checking vitals? Replacing the camera? Now or never. I exploded upwards, jamming the sharp plastic shard towards where I guessed a thigh or abdomen might be under the loose-fitting gray uniform I glimpsed. A sharp intake of breath, a muffled grunt, contact. I didn't wait to see the effect. I scrambled past them, ignoring the flare of pain as something grazed my arm, and bolted through the now open doorway. A sterile white corridor stretched before me, lined with identical white doors, each marked with a different geometric symbol. I heard a shout behind me, the voice distorted by anger, no longer synthesized. Real. The captor was real. I ran, bare feet slapping on the smooth floor. Which way? At the end of the corridor, a heavier door with a small keypad beside it. My only hope. I sprinted towards it, hearing the footsteps gaining behind me. I reached the keypad, punched in the numbers Maria and I had deduced from the light flicker. 7, 3, 9, 1. A green light flashed above the keypad. A loud click echoed in the corridor. The door slid open, revealing not stars, but the mundane concrete wall and flickering fluorescent lights of a deserted underground service tunnel. Cold, damp air rushed in. Freedom? I plunged into the tunnel, running blindly, not looking back. I followed the tunnel as it twisted and turned, eventually finding a rusty ladder leading up to a heavy manhole cover. With the last of my strength, I pushed it open and scrambled out into an overgrown, abandoned industrial yard on the outskirts of the city. Night air, smelling of rain and exhaust fumes, never felt so good. I ran until I found a main road, flagged down a bewildered-looking late-night taxi. The police investigation hit dead ends. The industrial yard belonged to a defunct chemical company. They found signs of recent passage in the tunnels, but no hidden facility. My description of the white room, the screen, the sonic punishment sounded like delusion. Maria's tapped name yielded nothing. Without proof, without even the captor's face, the case stalled. They labeled it unsubstantiated kidnapping, possible delusional episode. I moved cities, changed my name, tried to rebuild. For months, there was nothing. I almost convinced myself the doctors were right, that it was all a complex breakdown, until the package arrived this morning. Small, plain brown box, no return address. Left on my doorstep. Inside, nestled on white foam padding, was a sleek, white data pad, identical to the screen in the room. As I picked it up, it powered on. Simple black text appeared. Experiment log. Subject Epsilon. Autonomy test complete. Proceeding to Phase 2 observation. I never learned her real name. That's just one of the unsettling facts that clings to me now, like the residue of a dream you can't quite shake. The first time I saw her, she was tucked into a corner armchair in the university library cafe, sketching intently in a small, worn, leather-bound notebook. She wasn't interacting with anyone, just utterly absorbed, pencil flying across the page, capturing something. Patterns mostly intricate and interlocking, vaguely unsettling but undeniably compelling. She had this aura of quiet intensity, a self-contained stillness that drew the eye. Her dark hair was pulled back loosely, strands escaping to frame a face that seemed both young and anciently weary. She'd occasionally look up, her gaze sweeping the room with sharp, assessing brown eyes before returning to her notebook, like she was cataloging the mundane world while inhabiting another entirely. She wore an old, faded olive green field jacket, the kind that looked like it held stories of its own. I ordered my latte and was waiting near the pickup counter when I realized I was staring. She looked up, met my gaze directly. No surprise, no reaction, just a level, knowing look, the kind that says I see you watching me. Normally, I'd fumble, look away, pretend to check my phone. This time, I just couldn't. I felt pinned by her stare. She didn't smile or frown, just held my gaze for a beat too long. Then slowly, deliberately, returned to her sketching, a tiny, almost imperceptible quirk at the corner of her lip. Felt less like dismissal and more like acceptance, like she'd expected it. When my latte arrived, I deliberately chose a table within her line of sight, pretending to read a textbook. I'm not subtle. I'm sure she knew. I'd steal glances. She'd continue sketching, occasionally pausing to look thoughtfully out the window, her pencil tapping a silent rhythm against the paper. I'd never been so intensely aware of another person's presence. After maybe 15 minutes of this silent observation, she closed her notebook, stood up, and walked directly over to my table. She didn't ask, just pulled out the opposite chair and sat down, placing the leather-bound notebook on the table between us. Up close, her eyes were even sharper, intelligent and unervingly perceptive. Her posture radiated a calm confidence, as if this unexpected intrusion was perfectly normal. My brain stalled. Years of social awkwardness kicked in, and I let out a short, nervous laugh.
Manager.
She didn't laugh back, just studied my face for a moment. You kept looking, she stated simply, not accusingly, just factually.
I'm Anya.
Over the next few weeks, Anya became a fixture in my life, yet remained an enigma. We fell into an easy routine meeting at the library cafe, taking long, aimless walks through the city at night, sharing cheap takeout on park benches. We talked for hours, but often about abstract things, patterns in nature, the feeling of old buildings, dreams. She'd share fragments of her life, cities she'd lived in briefly, landscapes she'd sketched, but always vaguely, without specific names or timelines. It felt like assembling a mosaic with half the tiles missing. Every detail she offered only deepened the mystery, made me want to understand the parts she kept hidden. I found myself texting her late at night, just to see the delivered checkmark turn into read. She'd often reply instantly, sometimes with an obscure song link, sometimes just with still drawing. I'd stay awake, trading messages, sacrificing sleep just to keep the connection going, feeling pulled into her orbit, like being near her was significant, even if I didn't know why. It felt like she saw something in me, had chosen me for some unspoken reason, and questioning it felt like rejecting a rare, strange gift. One evening, I was crashed on my couch, phone pressed to my ear, catching up with my friend Mark, rattling on about work frustrations, weekend plans, the usual mundane stuff. We were laughing about some terrible movie he'd seen when, almost unconsciously, I started to tell him about this fascinating, mysterious woman I'd met. Her name is Anya, and she dash. Suddenly, she was there, standing silently beside the couch, having moved from the kitchen without a sound. Her hand was outstretched, palm up, demanding the phone. Her face was devoid of expression, but her eyes were chips of ice. Startled, I handed over the phone automatically. Before I could fully process it, she thumbed the end call button, cutting Mark off mid-word. She stared down at the dark screen for a moment, her knuckles white where she gripped the phone. Then she looked at me, her gaze pinning me to the couch. "No one," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "can know about me. Understand? No one." Her intensity was frightening. It wasn't a request. It was a command layered with unspoken threat. I just nodded slowly, my throat dry. She held my gaze for another long moment, then placed the phone carefully back on the coffee table, her fingers brushing mine, the touch surprisingly cold. "If anyone knows," she added softly, looking away towards the window, "if they find out, they will come. Just that." "Who?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Who will come?" She wouldn't answer, just shook her head slightly, a curtain falling behind her eyes. The subject was closed. I didn't push. Something in her stance, a sudden vulnerability beneath the iciness, warned me that pressing further would be a serious mistake. Later that week, trying to pretend things were normal, I was chatting with my coworker, Sam. He asked if I was seeing anyone. Trying to be funny, playing it cool, I said, "Yeah, sort of, seeing this amazing artist. She's brilliant, but, kind of intense, likes her privacy." I laughed it off, told Sam to keep it under wraps. The moment the words left my mouth, I felt a lurch in my stomach, that cold feeling again, like breaking an invisible rule, like speaking her existence, even vaguely, had consequences. That night, it was late, maybe 1 a.m. We were at my apartment, sprawled on the couch, watching some black and white sci-fi movie on low volume. The only light came from the screen, casting flickering blue shadows. Anya's head rested on my shoulder, her usual intense focus softened, almost peaceful. I felt a surge of affection, a sense of impossible luck. Her laugh, when it came in response to something absurd on screen, was low and genuine, vibrating through me. Impulsively, I leaned in and kissed her. It started gently, but quickly deepened, that familiar magnetic pull taking over, the rest of the world fading away. Suddenly, a low humming sound started, not from the TV, not from outside. It seemed to emanate from the front door itself. A deep, resonant vibration, almost below the threshold of hearing, but felt intensely in the chest. We both froze, pulling apart. Anya's eyes locked on mine, wide with a stark terror I'd never seen in her before. She listened, head tilted, utterly still. Her eyes darted to the door, then back to me, silently screaming danger. We didn't breathe. The humming intensified, making the floorboards vibrate faintly. Then came a soft, insidious slithering sound against the outside of the door, like fine sand pouring or dry leaves skittering across the wood. Anya's hand clamped over my mouth, her fingers ice cold and trembling against my skin. This wasn't her usual collected self. This was raw fear. My eyes shot to the door. The humming seemed to seep through the wood. Anya's hand pressed harder against my mouth. Her eyes pleaded with me not to make a sound. I felt trapped, my heart hammering against her palm. My gaze flickered towards the fireplace, where I kept an old, heavy wrought iron poker propped against the bricks, more decorative than functional, but solid. Slowly, carefully, I eased away from Anya, pointing towards the fireplace, then back at the door, raising my eyebrows in a question. She gave the slightest shake of her head, eyes still wide with terror, but staying passive felt impossible. Ignoring her silent plea, I slid off the couch and crept towards the fireplace. The poker felt heavy, cold in my hand. The humming vibrated through the metal. I moved towards the door, poker held low, ready. Every step felt weighted, the air thick as water. I stopped a few feet from the door, listening. The slithering sound continued, rhythmic, dry. I risked a glance at the peephole. Darkness. The hallway light must be out. Or blocked. A shadow shifted under the door. A brief occlusion of the thin line of light from the living room. Something was crouched low right outside. I stepped back silently, pressing myself against the wall beside the door. The slithering stopped. The humming pulsed, a nauseating thrum. My ears strained in the silence. Then, a whisper. Right through the wood, papery thin, multi-voiced. "We know she is here. Open." My blood ran cold. It wasn't one voice. It sounded like dozens of dry voices whispering in unison. I wanted to yell, to challenge them, but Anya's terrified face flashed in my mind. I stayed silent, gripping the poker until my knuckles were white. Minutes crawled by. Maybe 5. Maybe an eternity. The humming pulsed steadily. No other sounds. Were they waiting? Then, faint footsteps. Not heavy boots. Lighter. Moving away from the door down the apartment hallway. Not rushed. Deliberate. Leaving. My breath escaped in a shaky gasp I didn't know I'd been holding. I waited, listening until the footsteps faded completely. Silence returned, heavy and absolute. I looked towards where Anya had been. She wasn't on the couch. I scanned the room. She wasn't there. Had she slipped out while my attention was on the door? Then I saw the closet door across the room was cracked open slightly. I could just see the whites of her eyes in the darkness. She was still shaking her head. It's not over. I lowered the poker slightly, muscles aching from the tension. I was about to whisper her name when her eyes shifted, looking past me, towards the hallway leading to the bedroom behind me. Her face contorted in utter horror, mouth opening in a silent scream. Ice flooded my veins. I spun around, raising the poker. The hallway was dark, save for the flickering TV glow. But it wasn't empty. Shapes moved there. Not one tall figure, but multiple small, skittering shadows, flowing like liquid darkness along the floor and walls, seeming to coalesce and then dissipate. They made no sound, but their movement felt anciently wrong, defying geometry. They pulsed faintly, in time with the now returning low hum. My heart seized, frozen again. They hadn't left. They had come inside. How? The shadows flowed together near the bedroom doorway, forming a vaguely man-shaped mass of roiling darkness, taller than the doorframe, impossibly thin. It didn't have a face, just a deeper patch of blackness where one should be. It tilted this non-face towards me, as if considering me. My body reacted before my mind could. A guttural yell tore from my throat as I charged forward, swinging the heavy iron poker in a wide arc. Not thinking, just pure survival instinct. The poker connected with the coalesced shadow mass. There was no solid impact, more like hitting dense, cold air. But the mass recoiled, dissolving instantly back into dozens of smaller, skittering shadows that flowed impossibly fast back down the hallway and seemed to seep under the closed bedroom door. The humming stopped. The apartment was silent again, except for my own ragged breathing. I stood there, poker raised, shaking uncontrollably. It took a long moment for my vision to clear, for the adrenaline to recede slightly. Anya emerged slowly from the closet, pale and trembling, clutching her small leather notebook to her chest. Her eyes met mine, filled with a mixture of fear and something else. Resignation? "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You shouldn't have let them know you could see them." "What were they?" I gasped out. "Who are they?" She just shook her head, clutching the notebook tighter. "It doesn't matter now. They know about you, because you talked." She looked towards the front door. "They'll be back. For both of us." Before I could respond, she walked quickly to the front door, opened it, and stepped out into the hallway without looking back. "Don't try to find me," she said softly, her back to me. "Don't ever say my name again. It's the only way they might leave you alone." Then she closed the door, leaving me alone in the silent apartment. That was the last time I ever saw her. Her number was disconnected by morning. No social media footprint. No trace. I wanted to call Mark, Sam, anyone, tell them what happened. But Anya's final warning echoed in my ears. "Don't ever say my name again." Weeks passed in a haze of anxiety. Every shadow seemed to move. Every quiet hum felt like a prelude. I was cleaning, trying to impose order on the chaos in my head, when I found it, tucked under the couch cushion where Anya had been sitting. Her small, worn, leather-bound sketchbook. I hesitated, then opened it. Page after page of those intricate, unsettling patterns she was always drawing. Geometric, yet somehow organic, they seemed to writhe on the page. I flipped towards the end. The last few pages were different. They were filled with rapid, frantic sketches of the skittering shadows I'd seen. Dozens of them. And on the very last page, dated the morning before the incident at my apartment, was a single detailed drawing. It showed the coalesced shadow figure, tall and faceless, standing in my hallway, and beside it, a smaller figure raising a fireplace poker. She hadn't just seen them before. She'd known they were coming for me,